So what's really also important here is where do these things happen within the cell? And the key thing as well is this mainly happens, obviously in the adrenal cortex, the zone of fistula for cortisol specifically. But this process actually happens in a lot of cellular types as well. The steroidogenesis actually happens in a lot of them. And like in your skin and your immune cells also produces these molecules, not way to the same level and systematically as your adrenal glands do. But it's very important to understand that you sort of have this local tissue production of these these hormones, and more so cortisol specifically that we're talking to you this afternoon and tonight. The other important thing is this these two enzymes here, this sort of same family, hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So the 11-beta hydroxydehydrogenase, I'll just leave it as HSD1, that mostly converts the sort of inactive cortisone into the cortisol. But it can operate in reverse in an NADP, NADH, or vitamin D3 dependent manner. Whereas the HSD2 works in reverse. It deactivates the cortisol, the active cortisol into corticosteroid. But what's really important here is most of these steps happen in the endoplasmic reticulum of the cells. But these key steps here and the final conversion of deoxycortisol into cortisol and the oxycorticosterone and the corticosterone and aldosterone and cortisol and its precursor to pregnenolone all happen in the mitochondria. So it's already telling you how important the mitochondria is and how important the transport of cholesterol into the cell is in explaining some of the defects that can possibly happen, why why the symptomology with excess cortisol or insufficient cortisol has an effect on the mitochondria. So what's really interesting as well is this is also very highly dependent on cholesterol, and we sort of see that high inflammatory markers, low cholesterol. So basically, a high stress stimulation, high inflammation, and nothing to feed your cortisol increases mortality. And in a world at the moment that I think you've probably took everybody's cortisol at the moment over the past year will probably be quite high, or in actually. This is actually plays a very important role in, critically ill patients or severe COVID patients. This whole cortisol story, and I've got some great references throughout this whole thing that talks about, about this sort of thing in what I refer to. So obviously, cortisol is released in response to stress and also in low blood glucose. But it's also for the HPA axis, a dineural or a circadian rhythm cortisol of like this high cortisol release in the morning, and then it finishes over the night, over the day and into the night. So that basically the cortisol increases your blood sugar levels through gluconeogenesis, stops the uptake of glucose, breaks down the glycogen. So basically, just readies the glucose ready. It's basically getting you ready for a stressful event. And also, it starts then, affecting your fat, protein, and carbohydrate metabolism in response to stressful situations, be it psychological, physical trauma, to inflammation, oxidative stress, infections. So like any of those biological, physical, psychological stresses on the body, it reduces the body's response to it so that you're able to maintain homeostasis. So we also see that, in long-term levels of this cortisol, it actually leads to the breakdown of proteins, inhibits collagen production, increases the amount of circulating amino acids. So you start seeing this sort of sarcopenia. And then this long-term, high blood glucose level increases insulin insensitivity, increasing fat storage. So you get that sort of very much typical inflammatory obesity person, you know, that large belly and scrawny limbs, because they're getting sarcopenia and fat gain in their central abdomen there. It also suppresses the immune system because it's anti-inflammatory. It strongly, you know, dampens down the immune response into responsiveness. And also, it's a minor mineralocorticoid. Aldosterone is our big mineralocorticoid, but it also has a minor mineralocorticoid. So it starts moving, you know, excreting out, you know, potassium, calcium. And so you can, in extreme case, lose bone with excess cortisol. So it also increases your blood pressure, as I mentioned, you know, there for, you know, increasing the sensitivity, you know, angiotensin and stopping nitric oxide. So sort of short term, it prepares your body for an event and readies your body for an event and makes you adjust. But obviously you could see how long term you could start developing problems if your body remains under stress and your cortisol remains high, trying to deal with that stress. The key thing is actually made on demand. So it's not stored generally. And it's highly dependent on cholesterol, mostly HDL. If we actually deplete HDL, you cannot make cortisol. So it's very, very important. And it's made in that that sort of thing. And as I said earlier, inflammation reduces its synthesis. And it takes about 10 minutes to the adrenals to produce it. So that say that initial scare, or you know that you're a very stressful individual, and you sort of get, when you get into that, you know, this is more psychological, when you get into that initial scare, that quick response is your epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline or noradrenaline response that quickly degrades. So you have the sort of quick response of your adrenaline and noradrenaline, and then which quickly degrades, and then you have this cortisol release that's lasting, you know, for 1 to 2 hours. It takes a little bit longer, but sort of is trying to calm everything more down again. And because it's lipoferic, it requires carrier proteins. It's mostly bound up in the cortisol binding proteins, and also a bit in albumin. So only 5 to 10% is the free unbound cortisol, which is the biologically active one, which then moves into cells, may bond to the glucocorticoid receptors, may stay as cortisone for a little while, and transfer back and forth between those enzymes that I keep on forgetting the name of at the start, but the cortisol to cortisone enzymes. So it's a, you know, it responds, it's ready, it's not stored like many other, you know, neurotransmitters or hormones. It's made to order upon stimuli working together with adrenaline, which brings us to how it all happens, to that hyperpituitary adrenal axis, connecting, you know, both your brain and also external stresses globally to controlling that stress response initially. So I'll sort of start with the classics and then move out from there to give you a better understanding. So generally what happens, we have a sort of stress things, say psychological stress, being indoors, living with COVID, and that causes the hypothalamus to release corticotropin releasing hormone or releasing factor, which then causes in the pituitary, binds to the receptor there, and causes in the prenatal POMC to be broken down into beta endorphins, as well as adrenocorticoid hormone. Now that goes into the circulation and gets to your adrenal glands, and more specifically into your adrenal cortex, and more specifically that, your zona fistula of your adrenal cortex, that binds the MC2 receptor, that then initiates the capture of collection of cholesterol into the mitochondria, and to initiate that whole program to start making cortisol, which goes into the system and starts doing its work, dampening their immune response. Now, the key thing is, as well, as it has a feedback mechanism. So it dampens the immune responses and tries to stop that inflammation and other pathways to sort of trying to deal with that biological side of the stress, as well as it cancels the release of corticotrophin releasing hormone and the breakdown of POMC. So it sort of causes its release, it gets its release, and then also feeding back to stop it from getting ahead of itself and getting too much release. To start expanding this further, so in the morning, or, you know, it's the saying, we're living in a world, I like to say we're setting a new world of homeostasis. Here I am, it's 7 o'clock at night, blue light blasting into my eyes, and that causes a release of corticotrophin releasing factor, which will then activate my cortisol. So at the moment, compared to my ancestors at night, I'm having a lot more nighttime cortisol, which sort of fires me up, keeps me awake, and makes it much more difficult to get to that lower cortisol level to allow for the proper cycle to continue. So, but not only that, sort of external physical and biological stresses, say in skin, and also immune system will also initiate the release of corticotrophin releasing hormone and activate this pathway. Along with that, as I mentioned earlier, you get that initial release of adrenaline and noradrenaline once it sees that initial adrenocorticotropic hormone release, and actually increases that level and pumps it out more. So it's sort of like, I guess you could say the first 10 minutes, this HPA axis is governed by the adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine, depending on which country you're from, to, you know, fire the system up and going. And then the cortisol will start kicking in to dampen things down again. The other interesting thing as well is it's actually very important for memory formation. Both the adrenaline and the cortisol actually really helps in sort of like the photographic light bulb memory, getting that vivid memory, I guess, sort of so you remember what can happen. And we often see that people that have poor cortisol levels have poor memory. Let's grab a quick drink, sorry. So what's actually really interesting, the corticotrophin releasing hormone actually is both pro and anti-inflammatory depending on the types of cells. And what's really surprising, you'll find that glucocorticoid response elements, or i.e. the genes that are expressed due to the glucocorticoid signaling, it's about 20% of our, actually even higher. So I think it's close to about 25% of our genome. So it's very, when I sort of saw that, that just sort of blew my mind and realized sort of just talking on this sort of basic level is going to be problematic because we're not going to get the full picture, because, and it also explains why you see this sort of contradictory nature of cortisol, because it's very tissue and cellular specific, because it's epigenetic dependent on what genes are free to be allowing the binding of the transcription factors resulting from cortisol signaling. We also see cortisol being produced heavily by your adipocytes, other parts of the brain as well, not just in the hypothalamus. Your intestines and colon, heart and lung also produce cortisol sort of locally to help them deal with their stress response as well. And also importantly too, the thymus to actually help control the T cell function as well. So I thought it was important to talk about, I guess, the real key clinical deficiencies and excess before we start, I guess, why you're all as integrative medical practitioners start looking at, I guess, the more edge cases when things are a little bit before they get into the serious zone. But it's also very important to talk about, yes, there is big cortisol adrenal problems. Obviously, Cushing syndrome causing hypercortisolism, you know, with the tumors, or even caused by your steroid hormones if you introduce treating inflammatory conditions. And obviously that's hallmarked by that long keeping that level of cortisol high, so you end up with that weight gain due to insulin sensitivity, hypertension, and that poor glucose tolerance. And you see those people with Cushing's syndrome just inflate because of all the fat that they're storing, or even and also they also get poor sleep because they can't calm down with the cortisol being so high, and those sort of things like that. And then we move on to hypercortisolism, and Anderson disease is prevalent. I think it's relatively prevalent actually within populations anyway, of just a poorer, 1 in 10,000 people. And given your line of work of being much more integrated practitioners, you probably see a lot more tricky cases. So you're probably seeing a lot more patients probably with Addison's disease or that hypocortisolism due to improper, adrenal. It's either mostly injury, most of the time it's adrenal insufficiency, so adrenal gland is damaged, or poor blood flow, or physical damage, or actually autoimmune diseases, and having an infection like TB, and also medications can cause damage to the adrenal glands. That's actually quite a thing. Nelson's is probably less prevalent. That's actually caused by basically people surgical intervention of cutting off one of the adrenal glands. So that's becoming less prevalent as that treatment has gone away. And also you have Sheehan syndrome, which is I believe much more present in the regions that you're from, because it's a birth defect, which is the pituitary gland. So basically the gland responsible for the adrenocorticotropic releasing factor dying and no longer able to initiate that HPA axis result. But it's really important to sort of look at the symptomologies that you actually get with this, because, people that, say get the burnout or the, or then also obesity, diabetics, and all those sort of things like that, show symptomologies of the sort of hypercortisolism or hypocortisolism. So what the key thing as well is what we see, which is really problematic, especially on medication more so, or in an Addison crisis, is that, hypoglycemia, dehydration, salt wasting, and obviously that's got to be very much lethal. You get a dropping of your blood pressure. Well, what we're probably dealing with most is this really non-specific sort of source of that fatigue and weakness. And we generally see this associated with the autoimmune diseases, type 1, thyroid, celiac, and the withdrawal of your corticosteroids. If you've got inflammatory treatment, after 1 week of use, you'll see this. Basically, you've got given, in the case of the medication, you got given this artificially high cortisol level in order to maintain homeostasis. You prune off your receptors and decrease your natural HPA axis. And then when you withdraw, you're now at a much lower level. High is kind of more associated with sort of cancers and obviously type 2 diabetes. But it's kind of interesting because there's sort of an overlap of sort of like these sort of autoimmune diseases in both high and low cortisol. And we'll explain why a bit later on. So obviously with obesity, a lot of it's around basically initially that sort of fat mass sort of feeding further that cortisol, which then feeds higher insulin and higher leptin. And so you get this sort of hyperglycemia effect. And what we also see as well is this sort of high inflammation that's caused by a lot of this, fat onset that's associated. We see actually an inhibition of that HESD2, which converts cortisol into cortisone, which means we end up with a lot more free floating cortisol floating around even more, feeding on the insulin and things, which is why you're seeing these patients, with these cortisol problems gain weight. And this sort of goes through further, and recommend these references that talk about these sort of things to you. But basically, you just, you're getting these, basically diabetic-like symptomology that's been forced by what cortisol actually does to your metabolism by, activating gluconeogenesis and stopping and breaking down glycogen and increasing insulin, desensitizing yourself to insulin. But I thought what was really interesting as well is actually talking about addiction, why people maybe even get addicted to stress. And this was sort of going back, I thought a talk I'm really fascinated by addictions. And one of the things that always really blew me away around addictions was, other than taking substances, other than taking the substance, the second cause of relapse, so basically the first cause of relapse, because I sort of regard taking the substances, you basically started your addiction again, is stress, life stress. And I thought that was really, really fascinating. And this is the link between what's happened, and, because CRF and cortisol is produced throughout the brain, and also in the key part involved in addictions, your mesolimbic system, which is the reward pathway, which is pretty much using all sorts of different neurotransmitters in different parts of the brain, your mesolimbic system, basically resulting in a release of dopamine into your nucleus accumbens, which is your final reward, and that feeds the addiction pathway as such. So it's all about that dopamine release into the nucleus accumbens. But obviously, taking a substance, addictive substance in itself, actually causes a release of cortisol, which acutely, the short-term actually exposure of glucocorticoids to the nucleus accumbens actually helps the dopamine sensitivity, helps the dopamine release, along with the substance itself has dopamine. So get this actually double whammy of both the stress response to, oh, there's a bit of a toxin here, better calm down my system a bit, as well as what these toxins actually do, and they are literally all toxins, causes that natural response. Because also the thing is as well is that, that stress response, the cortisol releasing factor or hormone, also activates that glutamate excitatory release. And obviously if you stimulate that further and further, that can lead to neuronal death. But what's really important is when you hit that all the time, that continuous stress response actually dampens drops the level of dopamine release into your nucleus accumbens. And that's what actually starts feeding the addiction and wanting, because your body starts wanting to take this drug because it's going, I'm feeling really crummy, I don't have any dopamine, and adding stress upon it, your body starts going, well, when I stress, I took this drug and it made me feel better and got rid of my stress. And that's what sort of feeds the addiction. So in sort of reverse, people, say they're addicted to stress. Well, that constant stimulation, short-term stimulation of the glucocorticoid pathway starts feeding into that dopamine release into nucleus accumbens, which then starts, giving them a reward for feeling stress. And the brain wants to make things automatic and learn things in that mesolimbic system, and wants to basically make things, so it starts relating stress with getting a reward, and you start preoccupying yourself by finding those sort of stressful situations. Also, in terms of that obesity side of that high glucocorticoids, you start wanting to eat high sugar, high fat, high salt foods to stimulate, because those foods stimulate your opioid and cannabinoid senses to give you that dopamine hit as well. So when you're stressed, you start hunting and wanting these very addictive, food types that you shouldn't really be eating. And then that leads further into the weight gain, which then starts the adipose start producing cortisol, getting leptin resistance, and insulin resistance, further feeding that metabolic side of high cortisol. So now moving a little bit on to, I guess, testing. And I thought this was actually quite fascinating. And I highly recommend, if you're doing testing, this is a really great review, because it's a bit of goes through all the positives and negatives around the different sources of testing. So basically, starting off with serum plasma cortisol, you're generally measuring what we call total cortisol, which is both the bound and unbound cortisol. You can elucidate out the unbound cortisol. It's a bit tricky to do, and you have to make sure that your lab is doing the right methods and that sort of thing. It's also kind of pointless just doing a random serum cortisol. It doesn't really give you any diagnosis or of adrenal diseases or anything like that. You really kind of need to sort of either do it, in late at night to make sure your cortisol's not high at night, or looking at early morning if you've got a cortisol insufficiency or excess happening. But you have to also look at other factors. And, after sort of read this, and also as I explained further, cortisol's response to all these other things, and the reason why you've sort of gone down this pathway to look at this integrated medicine approach is to find to solve the actual problem, not change a number. And I feel a lot with cortisol testing, you are just chasing a number. And I think what it really plays into is getting your patient to change and say, using the information to change them. But but there's also diagnostic ways as well. If you can measure your CRH or your adrenocortical release hormone and your ACTH levels, as well as DHA ratio to cortisol, and you can start to elucidate if they actually do have damage to their adrenals, damage to the pituitary gland, and that sort of thing. Because you need to pay attention to other symptomologies. If you have a liver problem, you've got to have less protein, decrease albumin, so your cortisol levels got to drop because of it, because there's not enough, there's not enough binding protein. But also in the elderly patients, the sarcopenic patients, low protein concentration, so therefore you're just going to get a low cortisol anyway. Estrogen increases the total cortisol because it increases the amount of binding protein. So it sort of, you have to look at the whole system entirely when you're doing the serum cortisol. Urine is actually a little bit interesting because it kind of, if you're doing like a 24-hour urine collection, it kind of gives you almost your average cortisol, which also can be quite useful. The interesting thing is when I look at sort of like the research relating cortisol levels to different diseases and outcomes, it's not as predictive. It doesn't seem to have a statistically significant association compared to saliva, which is far more related to your free serum cortisol. And so it reacts to your blood cortisol levels pretty quickly and sort of pretty reflective. So you can get to do that rhythmic cortisol measurement, and it's far easier to get a spit sample, at different time points than getting a urine sample at different time points. And what's really important when you're doing these tests and looking for these tests is you're really looking at trying to get that initial waking response. So the first sort of hour and a half, 2 hours, you want to get lots of data points in there so you can capture that curve, that waking cortisol curve, which to sort of help you a bit. And it's far more related to associations. The big problem is there's not sort of really any standardization. Each lab is very different. So I found sort of some graphs to use to show you what it looks like, but don't take the cutoffs as sacred. It varies a lot. And also, we do have these sort of problems of, we generally regard like the cutoff for, Cushing syndrome, i.e. high hypercortisol, sort of that 3 nanomolar level. But the healthy range at night could be 0.1 to 116 if we sort of look at all the studies. So there's still the standardization of the test is a bit flawed. So I guess my recommendation to help deal with it is probably stick to one or two labs that you're very confident with, and in terms of understanding that patient result and what's a true result and not a true cutoff. And also, I probably recommend more in terms of actually getting a proper value. It's actually make sure it's actually just spitting into a tube. If you use like a cotton swab or a sponge, what happens is it gets stuck in there and end up having to like dilute it. And so therefore you don't really know the true dilution of, what was the initial volume of spit to the dilution meter trying to get that spit off the swab or sponge there. And so the numbers are not quite right. But really, it's about that curve and it's a relative response anyways. But it's a bit problem, I guess, interrelational in terms of tests. So the cortisol rating response, as I alluded to, is why you probably look at doing, your morning, doing these cortisol tests and what a lot of the functional medicine practitioners sort of talk about. After going through all this, I'm sort of a little bit more shy around what this actually means. As I sort of said, you sort of end up chasing a number opposed to thinking about what is causing this cortisol, because it's pretty obvious when you sort of hear, what makes a candidate for someone to have a cortical, look at a awakening response. It's like, I'm feeling really tired in the morning. I need to take, 10 cups of coffee to feel awake. My autoimmune symptom seems really bad in the morning, or, my blood sugar seems to be way out and out of control in the morning and takes all day to calm down again. So that's sort of like the sort of sitting going, hey, there's something wrong here, and they're getting this symptomology. It's related to, and therefore the cortisol is going to be out of whack. You don't need a test to tell you that. I guess if you need them to convince them to do the intervention, because really at the end of the day, it's a lot of lifestyle intervention. There's no magic pill here. So you need to convince your patient to follow your activities, which a test is very useful for. But what you're sort of looking for is, once again, we have this diurnal normal cycle, and it does adjust with age. It gets flatter and flatter with age, and also, female, if pregnant or going through menopause, it changes and flattens off a bit. And so you also have to put that into account when you're measuring people, because generally, at that age point as well, autoimmune diseases may be starting to show up, thyroid problems are starting to show up, diabetes is starting to show up, therefore cortisol problems is going to start showing up, trying to help the body maintain homeostasis because of the development of these diseases. But generally what we see is this morning peak is about 50 to 150% above your baseline measure, about 30 minutes after you wake up. Remains high there for an hour, hour and a half, and then it will start to decline throughout the day, reaching its lowest point at midnight. And we actually don't know why we don't know why, because this is actually highly conserved throughout the animal kingdom. We're sort of thinking it's kind of like, as I sort of said, it's preparing us for any eventualities that we find ourselves in today. Also to sort of, ready, like wake up and off we go sort of scenario. So you get that blood glucose ready to run, the water osmotic potential sort of changes. You get all that anti-inflammatory, so you sort of dampen everything down. And, and so, when you sort of hear, people, feeling, if you've got a cold and you feel pretty good in the morning, you feel fantastic in the morning, and by afternoon you feel terrible. That's pretty much your cortisol, diurnal cortisol response. You feel, you're getting lots of anti-inflammatory cortisol effect in the morning, and then it dies off at night. Or, you sort of, maybe you wake up really, really, really sick, and then half an hour later you feel fine because the cortisol's kicked in again. It takes a little while for you to get that to that peak. So it's a really interesting thing, and we don't truly understand why. And basically, we do know that people having adequate or quite a large cortisol awakening response do deal with daily stresses, psychological or sort of like a biological onslaught, far better than people with a low cortisol awakening response. But obviously, a big driver is sleep. If you sleep deprive, shift working, sleep apnea, you got to see your cortisol response, awakening response just drop. And therefore, you get this more inflammatory factors in the morning because you're not getting your average cortisol is dropping throughout as a total throughout the day. And it's really interesting because we kind of see this sort of happen in sort of type 1 diabetes, chronic fatigue, syndrome, systemic hypertension, and even GI disorders. But I think, something like, GI disorders, I think they're just not sleeping more so than the GI disorders themselves causing a cortisol problem, although inflammatory itself will cause that local release of cortisol. And that increase in CARS we see in metabolic syndrome, MS, and infections, and that obesity that you see. So it's quite an interesting thing, and this is sort of what it generally look like. You can do actually both, and I think I just thought it'd be interesting to show you both urinary and cortisol, because I guess you could say urinary is a little bit more commutative. And obviously, it takes a lot longer for to express the urine. So therefore, your peak, say you're waking up at about 6 o'clock. So your peak becomes a lot later. It's a lot more sharper because you're sort of not getting the resolution that you can by doing a saliva cortisol response. And I think what's really sort of interesting is if you don't have that early morning cortisol response, you actually have poor memory from the previous day. You're not getting that adrenaline and cortisol to help reinforce those flashbulb memories, which I thought was interesting in itself. So, moving on to, sort of a high cortisol can either, look like, you shoot up, change the axis here to, plus 30 minutes, plus 60 minutes, and then like an afternoon night sort of reading. And it could be, quite a steep rise and, drop off, or steep rise sort of hangs, goes up and then hangs around for a bit and drops down like this. That's sort of what we sort of say is an elevated awakening response. And, this can be response to many sort of different things. A change in diet, if somebody's doing a fasting mimicking diet early on, they will have a cortisol response like this, because you're basically starving your body, and your body's waking up hungry and going, oh, gee, I'm hungry. You need to, hunt to gather. So I'm just going to flood your body, with glucose ready to do the things that you need to do. We also see this in people that are, what we call morning people. They just wake up ready to go. They normally have a very strong cortisol awakening response. Then we also, and I think to talk to more about the evolutionary aspect of this, if you're startled, woken up earlier than normal, or even, you get this much more high cortisol peak. So that sort of screams to, you just been scared, and it, activates your flight and flight sort of response there. If you're waking, and it's also anticipatory and also responding to previous day stress loads. We actually see, if you, and it's more controlled stress. So if you sort of know that you've got to be stressful for the day, you've got to see a high cortisol. If and generally if you have post-traumatic stress disorder and, just been hit by some sort of traumatic event, or PTSD, you generally have a lot more lower cortisol happening, and flattens you out a lot more, because there's a lot more going on there in the mitochondrial level that's affecting your whole system, let alone your cortisol production and response. If you're taking obviously stimulants in the morning, that's going to do it. And you're waking up in pain, inflamed, or having an infection, you've got to see this morning cortisol be higher than normal. Ovulation as well. So it's, if you're doing this test, you kind of want a standard day, or if you want to see how this person responds to a stressful situation, that you're not taking your adrenal support, or maybe you need something to calm you down, and you're convincing, do this test on a stressful day, and you'll see this really high, and compare it to like a normal day. See, you're getting all this cortisol, which then if you allow this high cortisol, because don't forget, it's the area under curve, over long periods, is going to cause those metabolic problems and things like that. And also, obviously with diabetics, you got to, if they're under stress, be it, mostly psychological in this case, if you're seeing this early morning blood sugar spike and they haven't eaten yet, that's going to push their HbA1c up and, increase their insulin insensitivity and decrease beta cell function for them. And so you need to sort of start looking at ways of addressing that early morning cortisol spike that's then causing that early morning glucose spike for them. So, you know, we see this sort of thing in burnout, chronic fatigue, people with sleep apnea, chronic pain. I pretty much basically say people that are not sleeping well. Also people that are taking sleep medication to help them sleep because they're actually not getting the proper sleep cycle. We actually need to get into really a stage 4 sleep to actually get to our bottom cortisol. Otherwise, we just never really do. And that's the lowest glucose demand. So just very good. Also, when people are taking all sorts of steroid medications or isotretinoin, the acne cream, it's got to cause that decrease in, you know, your cortisol production, which is got to be problematic because you've got to allow things, your stresses to run away because the cortisol is not going to be able to respond adequately. And we see this sort of happen when you have this low cortisol response and related to mortality for breast or prostate cancer. We see low CAR increases the chances of mortality because it's not sort of activating the systems to able to deal with the stress that the cancer is putting on your body and your immune system there. And we see this also with autoimmune patients because obviously you're starting to get a lot of damage to your systems and your thyroid. So, yeah, so, and also problems with, you know, your brain glands, your pituitary and the like. So, but, you know, a lot of people talk about this adrenal, you know, what we talk about is adrenal fatigue. And I'm sure some of you, I think it's really important that this is very different to adrenal insufficiency, which I talked about earlier in the sort of clinical things, because it's a bit of a myth. It's not sort of really true because there's a mix of non-specific symptoms. And this really fascinated me because we always talk about in this field around, you know, that adrenal fatigue patient, like being hits, you know, being stressed for so long that things just tire out. And when you start looking into like the cortisol levels in these people, it's totally contradictory. We see high cortisol, we see low cortisol. It's non-statistically significant. It's each individual patient has a sort of different results, which means, you know, you don't really see any patterns. And unfortunately, we don't really have any medical markers for, you know, detecting that burnout and that sort of thing, that brain fog, that lack of motivation that we see in these really fatigued things that we sort of, and we see that things like adaptogenic herbs like, you know, Withania ginkgo, you know, Siberian and ginseng and you know, Panax ginseng and those sorts of things like that, you know, sort of improve these sort of patients because they sort of stimulate, so I say modulate the pathway depending on concentration. What I see is in this world, and I do not recommend this at all, is treating these patients with corticosteroid drugs. I cannot stress that enough because it's counterproductive as it will decrease the amount of receptors and stops your natural cycle of cortisol. You're treating a number, not looking at what is causing this low cortisol or the fact that, you know, this person has just lost any defenses to stop your body's stress response from overtaking them. And so I thought, well, this fatigue, this brain fog that we sort of associate with this adrenal fatigue sort of story, and we do see adrenal insufficiency starting to come in, what is going on here? What is causing this problem? And that's when I looked at, well, we mostly only talk about one half of the story. It takes two to tango. What about the receptor activity? And this is very, very important here because it explains the contradictory nature in the whole cortisol disease because, you know, as I said, because it responds differently. And as I said, 20%, 25% of the human genome are glucocorticoid response elements. That is gene expression that is responding to the transcription factor of glucocorticoid receptor. And the glucocorticoid receptor is actually part of a large family of nuclear receptors like NF-kappa beta. Once again, these, because we're talking about really old molecules here. Cortisol is a really ancient molecule. This is really ancient signaling going here along here with the pro-inflammatory NF-kappa beta and AP1. You know, these are highly conserved things. And what it actually is actually generally cortisol actually passes it freely through the membrane, and actually classically, it's actually a free floating receptor transcription factor. It also can be bound to the surface in a non-classical way, you know, doing non-genomic systems, but pretty much 95%, and we're still elucidating what exactly the genes are, but obviously we've seen it bind in certain genes for oxidation phosphorylation. Obviously so, because we're changing metabolism, we're getting gluconeogenesis, we're upping our ATP synthesis and everything like that. So obviously it's going to affect, be a transcription factor for the mitochondria. But classically, you know, cortisol diffuses through, binds to the receptor, and we see sort of chaperone proteins like heat shock proteins help chaperone it to translocate in to the nucleus. It may become a dimer, it may bind with other transcription factors, it may block other transcription factors, but either repress genes or initiate signaling. Now, this is really quite interesting because obviously you have, you know, this, what initiates this whole sort of story is you get this inflammatory response, you know, through biological, psychological stress, you know, LPS from your gut or an infection, you know, IL-1, TNF-alpha, stimulating, you know, its pathway, protein kinase factor, activating the transcription factors like NF-kappa beta, AP1. It, you know, produces the inflammatory response. And these sort of things can be stabilized through these protein kinases. But also there's other isotypes. The main one is glucocorticoid alpha receptor, which actually binds to the glucocorticoid, to cortisol. So that's your main, you know, receptor for your cortisol. But you also have glucocorticoid receptor beta, which is actually only found in the nucleus. It is actually inhibitory to the processes. It actually stops the binding of the glucocorticoid receptor alpha complex from attaching to the DNA to start transcription or inhibiting transcription. So it's actually inhibitory. So this starts to give you a clue, you know, why, you know, people, you know, how could, you know, inflammatory conditions be associated with both high cortisol and low cortisol? Well, it depends on what the receptor, happening with the receptors, because it depends on what's happening first. You know, glucocorticoid receptor beta may have got there first and actually stopped, the inflammatory state has stopped the signaling. You've got tons of cortisol, but none of it's getting through. Sorry. And we see this mostly in like chronic illnesses and critical illnesses. So patients with severe COVID-19 will have a high glucocorticoid receptor beta level, which is pro-inflammatory and that sort of thing. But I think what's truly fascinating, it gives you then actually an insight in really glucocorticoids are actually in the whole cycle of homeostatic correction, having the pro-inflammatory, supporting the and readying the pro-inflammatory response and reinforcing it, then the classic repressing, resolving, and even helping the tissue repair process is all part of this. So let me probably more break down this half, because this is quite surprising, well, at least to me, is how it actually activates and stimulates that pro-inflammatory and readies that immune system. But it makes sense. with that cortisol awakening, system that we have, it readies the immune system, because a key thing is it readies the immune system. And, cortisol actually stops the binding on NF-kappa beta. That's part of its process. It inhibits the binding of, transcriptional interference is what we call NF-kappa beta. It also inhibits the protein kinase, the actual signaling cascades as well. These proteins, and the glucocorticoid receptor itself binds to NF-kappa beta, binds to AP1, stop it from binding to its transcriptions, gene response elements, so that it does a pro-terrific response. But what we actually see is glucocorticoids actually increase the expressions of toll receptors in that morning early things, which obviously is a pro-inflammatory pathway, affects TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, epithelial cells, in epithelial cells, the glucocorticoids with the toll-2 receptor helps the secretion of IL-6 and IL-8, and IL-6, depending on its concentration, is both pro-inflammatory. It increases the sensitivity, these immune cells and everything to be ready to respond to onslaught, a stressor. And so, and then also it's involved in the inflammasome, the NLRP1. It's a key marker for the inflammasome, which is responsible for macrophages doing its thing, and that actually helps increases the NLP3 sensitivity to macrophages, so that it allows it to respond to cellular debris and free ATP. So it actually, it actually helped that glucocorticoids binding to the glucocorticoid receptor actually helps the immune process, but more really it readies everything, sensitizes everything, and also readies the response when it gets activated as well. And what I mean by reinforcing is, how I talk the fact that it inhibits NF-kappa beta and AP by actually binding to those transcription factors. What we actually find is there's actually a lot of overlap in the gene transcription, the gene expression in both these transcription factors, and there is a lot of genes that require both the glucocorticoid receptor alpha and NF-kappa beta, or AP1, to be bound together to actually allow the gene expression to happen. So it actually helps, because of that, it actually helps, helps that crossover. And what we actually see is this pro-inflammatory situation, and how, say, something like obesity and that pro-inflammatory cycle actually increases the expression of the HSD1, which is cortisone, and the cortisol, increasing that free cortisol level in the macrophages and pre and mature adipocytes there. And also helps pathways in MAP kinase and NF-kappa beta pathways, because it actually, gene sequences actually require these two things to bind together to actually allow their expression. Then finally, we sort of get into, I guess, what we traditionally talk about, inhibiting the pro-inflammatory response, stopping things from going ahead and starting to initiate repair, processes, starts promoting the anti-inflammatory phenotypes and enhanced phagocytic activity of macrophages, removing apoptic cells and tissues because of that. And we also see that with that glucocorticoid receptor there, it's able to help survival of cardiomyocytes triggered by, ischemic reproduction, that hypoxic, and also prevent that hypoxia due to ischemia. It helps resolve that and initiates tissue repair. It also helps basically any CD4 and CD8 T cells, because normally it's either one or the other, and if they have both and they fail, those T cells, if they don't get killed off, they will then start more likely to initiate autoimmunity in the thymus. The glucocorticoid receptor helps actually stop these self-targeting T cells and immune cells to survive and initiate their apoptotic process in the thymus. So you can actually see how it's more than just an anti-inflammatory in dealing with stress. It helps, prepares us for stress. It actually helps with, reinforces our body's response to stress, but then also represses, resolve it. We also get a release of a lot of pro-resolving mediators, fatty acid metabolites that are really important for finishing off the immune response is helped by glucocorticoid receptor activation. So as I alluded to earlier, the mitochondria is a really big part because you can start to see now that inflammation or oxidative stress or any sort of stress at the wrong time is going to trigger sort of things. And you can see like mitochondria is key to this because obviously, antioxidants and proper mitochondrial function is sort of got to stop this from happening. But oxidative stress, what ends up happening is causing a decrease in the number of glucocorticoid alpha receptors and their function. It stops them from binding. It stops them from translocating to the nucleus. It stops all these sorts of things of the glucocorticoid receptor. So you can produce as much cortisol as you want, but it's not going to do anything. And then obviously, well, because of the damage caused by the mitochondrial damage, by the oxidation and increase of, NF-kappa beta. So you can see the mitochondria, and then add on to the fact that it's a key responding to it, and it's key to the cortisol metabolism. So we probably do get adrenal damage because of this. And when we start actually talking about, mental health and really what our current understanding of mental health is an oxidative, inflammatory, mitochondrial disease from Alzheimer's to depression. We see how important this is because we actually see how chronic stress, and this is high, so therefore high cortisol, both biological and physiological, influences mitochondrial function. And this mitochondrial dysfunction is associated with name a mental health condition from schizophrenia to Alzheimer's to depression to anxiety, very much things. And then also think about your adrenal glands themselves. If you're having a lot of inflammation, a lot of stress going on, you're getting mitochondrial damage as well. You're going to get organ failure, tissue failure, that gland failure. So, maybe that adrenal fatigue is probably, that adrenal insufficiency is a far more correct use. And probably what's defining that brain fog, that lack of fatigue, is mitochondrial damage, because life is defined by energy and membrane potential. And a key part to that whole story of energy and maintaining membrane potential is the mitochondria. And what really sort of draws attention to this is a study where they looked at, fixing up Cushing disease, treating them, making sure they're on adequate cortisol levels and all that's control. But they still, the mitochondria and the adipose was still impaired, and as such, they still had insulin intolerance and still had that metabolic issue at hand, because although they fixed the cortisol problem, the underlying problems that high cortisol has caused, because they had a tumor in their pituitary gland, still needs to fix. Whereas, what we're probably dealing, a lot more is, the environmental stresses building up over time, causing these problems and mitochondrial damage leading towards this adrenal HPA dysfunction. And the key thing we actually see in both human and animal models, even acute stress, so psychological stress, let me correct that, results in release of cell-free mitochondrial DNA. And this cell-mitochondrial is a very pro-inflammatory molecule. Basically means that, cells are dying and spewing their guts everywhere, mitochondria falling apart. And we do see this as, we see more circulatory in aging, inflammatory diseases, but we see a massive increase in acute psychological stress injury. And as you probably are aware, mitochondria, are bacteria derived. We're not sure exactly how we got there, but they're basically bacteria derived. So to our immune system, free mitochondria are bacteria floating in our bloodstream. So when the immune system sees free mitochondrial DNA in the bloodstream, it freaks out massively. But the key thing is it starts producing antibodies towards the mitochondria, which then is actually one of the main initiators of autoimmune diseases when you're in this sort of pro-inflammatory, high stress sort of situation. The other thing as well is it changes the way the mitochondria move and therefore how they communicate, because the mitochondria like to be close together so they communicate to one another to be efficient. They also need to have adequate fusion and fission to respond to energy things, and high cortisol and stress stops that from happening. And also in your brain, I've sort of forgot to sort of mention, a lot of this cortisol problems that I'm talking about happens in the brain, which helps describe that fatigue, that low energy, that low memory function is happening in your brain and affecting your brain mitochondria because of the stress, both psychological and physiological, biological. And what we actually see is that in interfering, because what happens is astrocytes with the neurons take the damaged mitochondria and do autophagy to help repair them, but actually donate back healthy mitochondria to the neurons so that they can maintain their healthy function. They can't really do that with this high stress, high inflammatory conditions happening. It also, we get improper transport of the mitochondria to the synapses. So really what I'm saying is this chronic stress leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, maybe even eventual death of the mitochondria, that is giving us that adrenal fatigue story that it is. So cortisol is part of that story, but treating just the cortisol itself and pumping someone with low cortisol with lots of cortisol is really not solving their problem. And sort of to just talk a little bit more about that transport, because what we actually see is disruption to the mitochondria and this sort of pathway, here where basically it dissociates the mitochondria, from the endoplasmic reticulum and causes microtubule disruption. The microtubules are really, really important because they're responsible for transporting all those organelles, all those vesicles, all those exosomes, everything like that. All the transport happening into your nucleus, out of your nucleus, is all controlled by those microtubules. So if that is damaged, that, it starts becoming dysfunction. And these things, actually are vital for memory and synaptic function, because it's about transport of packets of neurotransmitters and information, chemical information, and that is disrupted by this high cortisol stress. Also, a really interesting molecule, it's been quite known for a long time, but it's been a big explosion in the last 2 years. I mean, if you probably paid attention to my reference that I use, all this stuff is pretty, last 2-3 years. Reelin is a molecule responsible for helping migration of neurons themselves in the right direction. And what we see in children, both pre-birth and just right after, in high stressful situation, has improper reelin function. And we see that we don't actually get proper neuron development from this high cortisol response. And this is actually associated with Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia, let alone depression and anxiety. So a little bit over, but we're just about at the end there. And when you sort of talk about treatments, I always forget about vitamin C. And I think it's important to sort of highlight vitamin C in this thing. And only 1,500 milligrams. Why? Because it's a cofactor in the biosynthesis of cortisol. It helps, obviously, the oxidative stress side, helps the adrenals actually, takes a lot of your body's vitamin C. So obviously it's very important for its function. So therefore it helps actually controls the level of glucocorticoid level. So it will help decrease it if it's high or help increase it if it's low. But not only that, it will also help support the other half of the story, the receptor, by making sure that the oxidative damage or NF-kappa beta activation stops that that oxidative stress, stops that glucocorticoid receptor being damaged and being oxidized, so it can longer function. So I just sort of wanted to highlight vitamin C, the least probably sexy vitamin out there, I think, at the moment, and we often forget how important it actually is, and how often when we talk about adrenal treatments, it often gets left to the wayside for some more exciting adaptogens and whatnot. As I alluded to earlier about treatment, there really is no magic bullet because it's about the root cause. Why is this person have this cortisol problem? Are they in pain? Do they have depression, the weight gain, the metabolic conditions? I mean, it may also, maybe it is important to do the testing to make sure they don't actually have a proper dysfunction in their gland, the adrenal glands, the pituitary gland, or the hypothalamus. But you normally see that with, brain trauma, or they've been, in uncontrolled, immunological conditions for a long time, or at a, superior age. And the treatment is really, if you've got like poor cortisol, it's about, sleep hygiene, the right amount of exercise. Obviously high amount of exercise causes an increase of cortisol in response to, you're putting your body under a lot of stress there during exercise. Interesting molecule, hydroxymethylbutyrate, with breakdown product of leucine, that's really good for the treatment of sarcopenia. But there's a couple of studies in both elderly and athletes showing how it decreases post-exercise cortisol. So that's a little interesting one for those that, are worried about, I guess those bodybuilders that want to have those mass gains and struggle to sleep at night. HMB is useful for that. Vagal nerve stimulation is so vital. The meditation, the yoga, and also don't forget the psychological, techniques to deal with stress or dealing with any of that PTSD or other sort of things. That lifestyle intervention, that boring stuff, rather than the fancy, pharmacological ways of doing things, is probably the most important side. Obviously, vitamin C. I forgot to mention as well, when your glucocorticoids are high, your tryptophan is normally a precursor to serotonin and melatonin. When glucocorticoids are high, it pushes that pathway more down, even more so down the kynurenine pathway, which then eventually goes on to make B3. So that's why they have, that high cortisol at night. You have difficulty sleeping because you're not really getting enough serotonin and, the tryptophan, carbohydrate, and serotonin, therefore melatonin. So you might not want to give tryptophan at night to these people because it won't really go into serotonin. You might want to use 5-HTP, and I forgot to mention melatonin in that list. I was talking to my dad just before this, and we'll talk about taurine. And yeah, taurine's actually, we were discussing how great taurine is, and I don't think people are appreciative of how useful it is. It reduces, in this talk sense, it reduces cortisol, it reduces the adrenaline responses and things like that. L-theanine is great, and phosphatidylserine as well for many different factors. Those pro-resolving mediators, endocannabinoids that help resolve that onslaught of the pro-inflammatory cycles, maintaining synaptic function and shape, is responsible for phosphatidylserine. Thiamine, especially in those B vitamins, because of the mitochondrial role. You're talking, I think about 20 to 40 milligrams. What's going on, like sort of a gram, maybe even 2 grams of taurine, 3 grams of HMB, 5-HTP. I don't really like to go above 200 milligrams, maybe 400 if you don't have any other psychological things, but generally 99% of patients no more than 200. And you do build up tolerance. Same with theanine, you build up tolerance, so don't use it all the time. Theanine's great. I use it before I speak to calm me down because it keeps you calm but maintains mental function. Fish oil also very, very important. More so EPA and DHA are becoming increasingly disappointed in DHA clinical effectiveness. I think you have to get to extreme dosages to see any clinical benefit, and EPA still outshines it. The ratio is important, but you need, ranging between 1 to 2 grams of EPA in itself for depression, anxiety, to your cardiovascular effects. I'm less of a herbalist, unfortunately, so I can't speak too much around the adaptogenic herbs. They're very, very useful acutely for short term. I wouldn't like to keep people on them for long term, because you need to be trying that, as this sort of name suggests, they are adaptogens, and to sound like probably what people, the extreme ends of diet people, the pure carnivore people, diet people, which I don't really agree with that diet in its entirety, sort of say, plants are trying to kill you, which is kind of true, but in a crude sense. But that's why these things are so beneficial, is they sort of help us modulate these pathways, and they are modulatory and what we call a hormetic dosing sort of response, sort of low dose stimulatory and high dose inhibitory of certain pathways. Obviously, check vitamin D status, because that's very important in immune function. And don't forget as well, because, precursor to cholesterol is vitamin D. And if you're producing a lot of cholesterol or a lot of other hormones, it could be pulling from that pool, reducing your vitamin D levels. If your cortisol is low, I mean, there's nothing wrong with caffeine. And don't forget around the mitochondrial support. Acetyl-L-carnitine has got some great clinical trials in the past couple of years, being really effective in treatment-resistant depression, 1 to 2 grams of acetyl-L-carnitine. So its mitochondrial function and its role in cortisol, and its whole cortisol story, is very, very important, along with the usual sort of stuff, as well as some of the polyphenols like quercetin and rutin, which help the biogenesis, which obviously, if you cause a lot of damage and loss of mitochondria, you want to help them grow and divide and get back to the levels where they want to be. So I'm going to end with you with this sort of, to reinforce this sort of, change the sort of paradigm of the way that you see, cortisol and the stress response, because stress induces increases in the glucocorticoid levels to protect us, not against the source of the stress itself, but rather against the body's normal reaction to stress, preventing this reaction from overshooting and threatening our homeostasis. Now, that was from Mugg in a publication in 1984. And I think the functional medicine world has kind of forgotten, we kind of view cortisol as a bad thing when it's problematic, and see it's the cause to a lot of problems. It's the response to problems. And it's getting to that root cause that we're all about. And I guess to leave you on the sort of note of, well, what is this new level of homeostasis that I'm living? It's 8 o'clock at night for me now. I've got blue light shining into my eyes, which is increasing my corticotropin releasing hormone, which is increasing my cortisol at night, so that I'm going to be awake for a lot longer. I'm not probably it's going to be a lot more harder to get to that lower level of cortisol at night. I'm going to have a lot more morning cortisol, which means I'm going to have a lot higher glucose level in the morning, which is going to increase my insulin levels and leptin levels, and potentially increase my insulin sensitivity. So, decrease my insulin sensitivity. So this is, we've seen, these increase of these different diseases, but don't forget as well as human lifespan hasn't really changed all that much. We're just getting a lot better at treating infections and, trauma than we are at actually increasing longevity. We still have a limit. It's all about health spans. So if you want to continue the conversation, please follow me on Facebook, Dr. Michael Osiecki. I've been a bit slack in this last month for posting stuff up, but I try and, post very interesting articles, not just nutrition, but anything on the health industry. And also my company page, By Concepts Facebook page. And fortunately enough, we've done a whole lot of stuff on mental health recently, which sort of perfectly aligns with everything what I just talked about today. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lisa, Dr. Sarah, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. It really is complete, a very thorough presentation. And I think we already have several questions. Would you like to start the Q&A sessions?
Yep. You just read the questions to me.
Okay.
Hang
on, Doc. Yeah. Okay. The first one is from Dr. Angie. I have a patient with low cortisol, about 5 something, and low ACTH. I don't remember the number. Can I use transdermal nicotinic patch for him? If I can use it, for how long should I use it?
Sorry, but I just had a little brief internet cutout. I assume it's a sort of low cortisol, low ATH.
Yes, and she was asking about, can she use a transdermal nicotinic patch? And if she can use it, for how long?
I mean, that's starting to sound like very much, adrenal insufficiency, caused by, if a either the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland, not functioning correctly. I think in that case, I think I was more referring to, I guess, that adrenal fatigue story where you're not as clear about what is the cause. So my guess is it sounds a little bit more brain, obviously a little bit more brain gland thing. So you could probably start looking at seeing if some of those sort of mitochondrial nutrients helps them more, and then decrease it down slowly and see what happens. You can't just take them off right away. But that case kind of screams to me more that, that's probably more of a glucocorticoid response than anything else. But yeah.
Okay. Dr. Angie, does that answer your questions? Okay, then. I don't. Okay. Next question, Doc, is from Dr. Sanki Lee. Doctor, I have a male patient, 30 years old, with low serum DHEAS and very low serum cortisol at 8 a.m. and at 4 p.m. So the low serum cortisol is at 8 a.m. and at 4 p.m. plus a fluctuated high blood pressures and fluctuated high heart rate and fluctuated energy. And the CT scan of adrenal glands is normal. Yes, MRI of pituitary gland is also normal. How should we resolve the symptoms and correct the adrenal glands?
I didn't hear any. Did the comment on the sleep?
I'm sorry, no?
Did they talk? Did the doctor mention anything about their sleep patterns?
Okay, Dr. Sankili. Dr. Sankili, could you turn on your microphone?
Yes, so please.
Oh,
Hello.
it's very, very good.
Yes.
Hello.
Yep.
Could you ask again?
I'm just wondering, what's your patient's sleep patterns like?
Oh, so he also has sleep difficulty. Sometimes well and sometimes not sleep well. Yeah.
And so that will be where I will be addressing their. That's where I'll be. One of my key works is looking at their sleep and how to improve their sleep. No blue screens at night, getting off the phone early. You could also look at the things like melatonin, 5-HTP, intermittently because you do build up tolerances to those sort of things. Do they have any, did you say they had any sort of, do you have any sort of symptoms of metabolic syndrome at all?
Yeah. Before he was more than 100 kg, but he used a supplement from Bangkok to reduce his weight, and then I think he took a medicine to lose weight for about 6 months, and later on he eat only vegetable to to maintain his weight. So first he used supplement, and then when the weight reduced, he maintained his weight through by eating only vegetable.
Okay.
And then later on, the symptom happens.
Mm-hmm. And does he do much exercise at night?
Exercise before not much, but later on he exercised twice a day, but still fluctuated heart rate, hypertension, and also the eyes feel like sleepy and a bit swollen, something like that, and like a warm around the eye.
Yep. Because the other thing that kind of just slipped the red flag to me is that what was in that supplement he took, because losing considerable amount of weight with something you're taking screams some sort of steroid, something that could cause damage to your adrenals and things like that as well. But I mean, definitely, so I'm a bit like, I put a red flag against that, but you did mention you didn't see any issues with his adrenals. I don't think you mentioned that, but that is definitely a red flag to me. That's definitely a red flag to me if they lost considerable amount of weight on a supplement. So I'm a bit concerned about that. But what I'm really thinking about is his sleep. That is really because the key thing is why is he seeing you? I mean, obviously the blood pressure, is he tired in the morning? Did he also say he had glucose problems as well? Because that's what I'll be treating. I wouldn't really screaming cortisol, because I think that cortisol is happening, that aberrant cortisol function is because he's not sleeping properly, and there may be some other issues there, and I'm deeply concerned about that supplement.
Doctor, he did not take a steroid. He took only a supplement, and then when I look at the supplement, it's like a plant-based supplement. The list like natural. No. I think the supplement seem not not affect the health, but I don't know whether he appear like that.
I'm just deeply concerned. So often we hear when like the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which regulates all medicines, including supplements here in Australia, test these sort of weight loss supplements, and you could probably share me that list of ingredients, and I could tell you right away that none of those ingredients will cause. Basically, I'm going is no supplement will cause significant weight loss, maybe a couple of kg, with no other dietary or exercise intervention. So I question what's in that supplement. That's why I put a red flag against that, saying he may have caused some damage to himself with a supplement. That screams red flag to me straight away. Even though what's on the label says it's all natural, they might have some sort of methamphetamine like substance in there. That as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh, there's something else going, and weight loss. I'm like, oh, no supplement should give you weight loss. This comes from somebody that makes supplements, designs supplements, manufactures a bunch of supplements. spends my life around looking at all these things. Nothing should give you, it's terrible evidence, and nothing should give you weight loss to that proportion without, you know, things like acetyl-L-carnitine, things may help assist along with diet and exercise, but you're only talking, you know, 0.5, you know, 500 grams, which is not, I wouldn't call that. So, but in what you've told me, because I think we've got other questions, sleep is probably one of the big underappreciated things that we talk about in this whole cortisol story.
Yeah, maybe if I can add a little bit, maybe Dr. Sankey, you should also look at the DHEA, because there's always have imbalance with cortisol, and also the thyroid, because the thyroid also works in conjunction with cortisol and sex hormones, the other sex hormones, because it's also in the same pathway. So it's probably not only the cortisol. I think.
Yeah, doctor, full thyroid function is in normal range.
Okay.
Yeah, but the hormone panel, because the patient could not afford, so we missed that test, but we did toxic heavy metal. The result not high. The toxic heavy metal in blood not high.
And his, I mean, it screams to me like, look at his sleep. Is there any other stressful situations as well? That's what it screams to me, other than red flags that I brought up.
Yeah.
And
I think I probably would also support the methylation, because if it is a supplement, then how you actually detox that, the excipients on that supplements probably also needs to be considered. So just if you support the detox pathway, because even though the heavy metal is not high, it's not supposed to be any heavy metal in our blood anyway. So it's also a burden. So even though it's very normal level, if your detox system or your methylation is not optimal, you would have issue also, even though it's normal. So it's a lot of things to consider, I may add. Is it any more, Dr. Sankey?
Yeah. So what else should be like? I mean, like the treatment protocol. So what like the protocol that we can increase cortisol and increase DHA, so that we can control the symptom?
It really comes down to assessing, or being not really a practitioner myself. I don't really, and so I really look at things as like, well, what's individually do with the patient. It's really understanding what they need in terms of sleep. What is, you know, it could be simple, you know, simplistically, you know, downers at night, things to help calm them down, like theanine or 5-HTP or melatonin at night, and then something a little bit more stimulatory, like, you know, and like some of those adaptogens, the panics, you know, ginseng, or, you know, Ruffania and Maria, and even some licorice and that sort of thing as well, or something carbative with holy basil. Their sort of, you know, keep their sort of, because it's a highly stressed psychologically person. So basically sort of look at, I want to calm him down at night so that he can get to sleep, meditation and that sort of thing, and yoga in the morning, and giving him some stimulation with some, you know, in the morning with some mitochondrial nutrients. Even does he drink coffee in the morning? Does he drink any caffeine or coffee?
No, he stopped. He
Oh, just hypertension. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
he stopped coffee, stopped milk.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I mean, the sort of protocol I recommend to you is sort of think of like, well, what can I do to calm him down at night, and what can I do to sort of stimulate him in the morning? And you check his DHEA levels. I'm sure in the previous lectures somebody's gone over ways of increasing that. I'm a little bit different, I guess, to a lot of what normally talked in the integrative medical world. I do not like using hormones. I think it was always back when I was learning about hormones in my biochemistry classes of, you know, they're at very low concentrations relative to a lot of other signaling molecules in our body, and they're very, very potent. And to put it very, very bluntly and very Australian, but I'll censor this swear word, is you do not whiff hormones in terms of introducing, you know, actual hormones in. I'm not a big fan of them. I just haven't been convinced by the evidence of its use, and well, maybe not its evidence of its use, its safety of its use. And I've seen people die because of using hormone therapy improperly. So I'm a bit hesitant even recommending a very weak hormone. DHA is actually a very weak sex hormone, shall we say, because it binds to estrogens and androgen receptors. So I'm a bit like, oh, I can't confidently recommend that to people, but I'm sure more experienced people in that area will and can help you how to prescribe that properly.
Okay. We already have a response from Dr. Angi regarding the first questions, Doc. She already used a mitochondrial supplement, and it's a very complete one, and a high dose vitamin C. She hasn't checked the patients again with the lab progressions. Do you have any comments on this, Doc?
So this was somebody
regarding the low cortisol.
They had low cortisol, but they also had low ACH.
Yes, ACTH.
Yeah, it sounds, you know, it's definitely sounded like, you know, like that sort of adrenal insufficiency, Addison-like symptomology to me, not knowing anything else and not having any other detail with that patient. So, but what are they like anyway? Like, you know, they just could be naturally low cortisol people. Like, are they struggling with memory and that sort of thing as well? Because, you know, once again, I can't recall if she mentioned anything around that, Lisa.
Okay, I need to ask her, but she is on her way of joining. So probably we head to the third questions. Can we, Doc? Yeah, okay. So next question is by Dr. Grace Lydia. Dr. Michael, is there a correlation between fluctuations in cortisol in our body and lack of microbiome in our gut?
I actually didn't look at this. I feel really embarrassed. So I can't actually definitively say. I'm sure there is, because there's stuff around, like, say, LPS being present, an increase of inflammation. Unfortunately, I feel a little bit bad. I didn't actually look at that. I completely.
Dr. Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I would say anything that causes inflammation in the gut causes that pathway to, you know, cause that fluctuation in cortisol, given the fact that the gut itself, you know, does make its own cortisol in response there. So, uneducated, yes. Maybe I'll get back to you on that one, but I completely slipped my mind to look into that. Sorry. Oh, Lisa,
yes, okay. Moving on to our next questions is from Dr. Angi. Adrenal doesn't have parasympathetic nerve. How the maintenance of the homeostasis in nature?
There is, God.
Is it correlated to the vagal nerve, though?
There is the parasympathetic nerves coming into the adrenal gland, but it's responsible for the release.
I think the cortisol is actually also responsible to take care of the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Anyway, with the adrenaline and noradrenaline actually produced in the adrenal.
And there is, but I just completely left my brain, but there is some nerve going into the central. I forget what the hormone is produced there. I just totally left my brain, but there is that balance. It's sort of, it's sort of. I guess there is a relationship to the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system because it's responsible for that homeostasis response. And it's sort of like the hormonic, it's a hormonic systematic response, not a nerve. It links a nervous response in the brain hormones, the corticotrophin, releasing factor and ACTH, to the release. So it does have a role in that side of it, but in terms of sort of like the adrenal release, it's a little bit separated from that, I guess you could say.
Okay, so I think today we have several connection problems. Yeah, mine too, actually. So we're moving on to the next questions. From Dr. Pipi Guizot. Doc, is ashwagandha aim to decrease cortisol level? And while Boswellia serrata aim to increase cortisol. So are these herbs safe to use?
It's a bit of an interesting thing. I'm not a herbalist. I kind of got the help of a herbalist in my team to help me with some of these sort of things. But there are, what we've seen in sort of studies, they do kind of help in the whole, they're sort of modulatory. When cortisol is high, they help to sort of bring it back down. And when the cortisol is low, it's help to increase it. But it's very much a dosage response, which I cannot help you with the dosage, sorry. With that sort of thing, I'm very not a herbalist to tell you the exact same why, but there's plenty of clinical trials on these ingredients, in probably more so in helping that adrenal response more so than dampening it, is from the stuff I've read thus far. So yeah, I'm unfortunately not really a strong herbalist, but I just wanted to put those things in there so you can go look up those things in yourself. Sorry about that. That's not really my strong area.
That's okay, Doc. As I know, the ashwagandha works both ways because it is an adaptogen, right? So, and it's quite safe to use. Okay, so moving on to our next question. Wait. Doctor, it's from Dr. Sanki Lee. Doctor, how to prescribe caffeine or coffee in adrenal insufficiency? There are a lot of supplements you mentioned in the treatment slide. If we choose only 4 items, what are they to be combined that work in synergy? Insomnia. I think he wants to know for insomnia, or Dr. Sanki Lee?
I reckon taurine, theanine, and 5-HTP, and I didn't actually include magnesium in there as well in terms of or something like glycine as well, like to calm you down at night for sleep, or you could replace that 5-HTP with melatonin. But it's probably better because you are a doctor to use melatonin. for that in terms of insomnia. Yeah. It was for insomnia, right, Lisa?
Yeah. Yes, I think he.
Sorry, not for insomnia. Just delete insomnia.
Oh, okay. So just four items. If we choose, if we can only choose 4 items, Dr. Michael, what will you suggest?
I'll sort of do maybe sort of stuff to bring things down opposed to stuff, and probably stuff to bring things up. Look, I have a bias because I'm not really familiar with herbals. I'm sure Dr. Lisa and Dr. Sarah could probably recommend one of those herbal ingredients to include, but vitamin C has to be one. I reckon, depending if they've got depression-like symptoms, I'll do. It's a bit hard because it depends on their sort of symptomology, and this is how I often think as well. Is like, what 4 things will I give someone? So this is really hard because it sort of depends on what you want to do. But it's definitely vitamin C, probably in one of those sort of adaptogen, maybe the ginseng probably has the most. One of those ginsengs probably has the most evidence, clinical trial evidence for. I reckon theanine is fantastic for those anxiety, depression, and they have vitamin D deficiency, of course, vitamin D, and maybe something, CoQ10 or taurine, which is more than 4. Sorry, it's really hard to sort of single down what would be the 4 best to cover your bases on everything. But I think it's sort of, it'd be safe to say something like vitamin C, something to bring you down at night, like theanine and and it's something like an adaptogen and CoQ10 in the morning to bring you up is probably how I think do the best. Taurine would be fantastic. Taurine would be fantastic. And it also, like, if they got really big, if they got depression, mental health, anxiety, then my prescription will more revolve around high dose fish oil, like 1 to 2 grams of EPA, vitamin C and taurine, maybe theanine as needed. Because theanine's a great band-aid of anxiety. I like to use it for performance anxiety, i.e. talking to you right now. I did 400 milligrams of theanine to keep me calm during the talk. So yeah, when you try to say what's the best 4 ingredients for this, is a bit hard because it's very patient symptom specific. But I think vitamin C would be one main factor. Yeah, sorry. Hopefully that brings it down.
Dr. Sankey? Yeah, okay. So next question, Doc, from Dr. Jonsu. It's likely.
Lisa?
Yeah.
Lisa, I just, if I can add a little bit about that.
Yes, of course.
I think it's a bit difficult when you manage adrenal insufficiency. It's every patient's responds differently with adaptogen. So it's what you have to say to the patient is this is kind of trial and error until you actually find the adaptogen that is suit you to your symptoms, because everyone is unique. But as what Dr. Michael said, then vitamin C is just a must. Sometimes vitamin C up to 2,000 milligrams a day help them already. And for my experience is B5, B6, B12 also have, so I give B complex apart from the adaptogen. And it's easier to give the patient mixed adaptogen in a capsule instead of just one by one, like ashwagandha only or boswellia only or lemon balm only. I think it's easier if you give a mixed adaptogen to me, to my patients, just give more good results than individual adaptogen. But then you look again, what is actually causing the insufficiency. So I just feel like I need to add from the clinical point of view, while Dr. Michael give in in the scientific, which we are all lack of. Thank you, please.
Thanks, Sarah.
Most welcome, Doc. So, okay. Next questions, Doc. Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So it's from Dr. Jonsu. It's likely the supplement is spiked with an actual drug in it, given phentermine, to have a clinical level effect. I had heard other lecturers suggesting using hydrocortisone 10 milligram to rest the adrenals. So what's your take on it?
Okay. I'm not sure if I quite understood that question. So basically, giving hydroxy cortisol for adrenal fatigue was basically what he was asking. Is that correct, Lisa? Dr. Lisa?
He asked, what's your opinion on giving hydrocortisones to resting the adrenals, maybe to support the adrenals?
Not the biggest fan of that unless it's very clinically specified to do so when they basically don't have an adrenal gland function whatsoever, Addison's disease. But if you sort of talk at this sort of subclinical sort of level, and I don't like it. Having taken like these steroids, had a massive eye infection, toxoplasmosis, well, it was prednisone, not hydroxychloroquine.
You mentioned before that, Doc, that you're not suggesting to use the hydrocortisones. Maybe you can explain more about that.
Yeah, it's mostly because these things are very controlled mechanisms. They're very sensitive mechanisms in play here, and long lasting. Like the hormones last for that hormone takes 2 hours to break down. Half-life, so it's still in the system for quite a long time after its half-life. And so what it does is it unnaturally increases the levels of cortisol in your body, and your body wants to maintain homeostasis. So what does it do to control that? It starts reducing the level of glucocorticoid receptors. It starts decreasing its natural level of production of cortisol by the adrenal glands itself. So I sort of see it as you're trying to, there's always, cases where you need to do this. You need to use, if they got completely shot adrenal glands, or the pituitary gland is gone, or really low hypothalamic function, had brain damage, then I could say, well, they need it. But for a lot of these sort of cases walking in, I really do not like it, because it's counterproductive to what you're trying to do, and trying to solve the problems, fix the root cause of the body by just artificially increasing cortisol is going to be problematic. You look, people that have steroid medication. I was sort of talking about a story of myself having a toxoplasmosis in my central macula in my left eye. So normally it's in the periphery. So I was hit heavily with high dose steroid medication to protect my central vision. And that I put on around 30 kgs of weight because of that. I had terrible sleep because of that. So you're not dosing at that level all the time. And then the withdrawal effects afterwards, you're riding a roller coaster of withdrawal effects. So how long are you going to keep that patient on that medication? Because, you have to step them down. If you just completely withdraw them, they're going to go crazy. So that's why I'm really, and as I said, I've seen people die. I've heard stories of people dying because of this, and that's why, this is probably my one critique, and I'm probably annoying a few people, but I like being controversial sometimes. This is probably one area that I don't really like in this functional medicine world, and that is hormone treatments. I really find that the safety is just not there, and it doesn't, unless you're really confident in what you are doing, it's not going to make you better. It's not going to make you live longer. There's a reason why these hormones drop over time, and you're probably better for it in your old age. So, I mean, I know people that have more experience than me use these things to be far more confident in their use. Even then, I'm still like, I think you can have other ways, but of course, there is, that's why I wanted to talk about those clinical cases of, you probably do need to use hormones in those cases there. So hopefully, I haven't too many people.
Okay.
I think you actually hello. I think you actually rest your adrenal by giving the adaptogen and do the lifestyle intervention. So you don't rest the adaptogen with the hormones. And if that doesn't work, then you might want to try the adrenal extract before you finally decided this patient don't respond on adaptogen, don't respond on adrenal extract, and then you try the physiological dose for hydrocortisone, which the adaptogen itself might take about 6 months to a year. You try on that first, but the lifestyle intervention really compulsory.
I mean, that's sort of my reading is really what it's about, because you look at these sort of symptomologies and you're going, well, not sleeping properly, they're highly stressed, or they're psychological, they have like autoimmune disease or thyroid problems, and you're sort of going, well, that's a problem. To give your adrenals a rest, you help them out psychologically, lifestyle, or find that disease issue that's truly the cause. Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah.
That's I agree. I think we should let you go soon because it's too late for you, right, Lisa?
Yes. Thank you so much, Doc. But I have a request to take pictures with all of you. So please, to all participants, to turn on your camera because we want to see all of you. Thank you.
At the moment. That's highly recommended. Don't at night what I'm doing. But
yes.
Cheers.